Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is the first video in a short series about the Qibla. And I thought I would go through a couple of different videos and we'll tell you the story of the Qibla as I see it and try to explain the way and the things that I have discovered. Now, 40 years ago, I started studying the Arabian Peninsula. The history of the Arabian Peninsula. I was interested in the Nabatean people, the people who built the ancient city of Petra, and so I studied and I prepared myself, went out to the Middle East, and I made a lot of visits to the city and to the surrounding area, and over the last 40 years, that was the focus of my studies. However, the last 10 years, I became interested in the study of early Islam. You see, what I had done is I had been studying the early history of the Arabian Peninsula. I had looked at the Edomite people and then at the Nabatean people and others in the area. I had spent almost 4 years in Yemen studying and learning about the Yemeni background and also trying to understand the culture of the Yemenis. And so it was more than just the history, but also who are these people, how do they think, and over those years I also spent time out with the Bedouin in the desert, just sort of immersing myself in the culture, the thought patterns, and the history of the Arabian Peninsula. And I realized quite early on, well, maybe after 10 years being there, that's out of 40 years, that there were some problems with Islamic history. I could see it from a distance, sort of, because I had studied the history of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's what I was doing. And as I was coming forward, having studied the time under the Greeks and under the Romans and so forth, and moving up to the Byzantine Empire, I began to realize my understanding of the Arabian Peninsula was quite different from what I understood of the history of Islam. See, in Islam, you work your way back. We know where we are today. We go back to Muhammad, who is the founder of Islam. And as we go back, it described Arabia at that time, and the setting didn't seem to fit. There was some sort of problem, and I said it's kind of like two ships coming, and they're passing by, but they should be meeting, and they seem to go right by each other. And there was something about the history, and I would tell my friends and people I'm studying, I said, I don't want to touch early Islamic history because I'm uncomfortable. There's something here, and it's going to take an awful lot of study. I mean, a lot of study. I mean, I could look at everything, but there was something here that I realized if I'm going to dig into this, it's going to take all my time, all my energy. It actually means a shift of what I'm doing and what I had planned to do in order to focus on this problem of early Islamic history. And so eventually several people pleaded with me, look into this. You keep talking about it, but when are you going to take time to actually study this and look into it? And it wasn't until the year 2010 that I had the opportunity to take a sabbatical and have 1 year for my own personal study and pursuit. And I decided, okay, I'm going to start at the beginning of the school year in September, and I'm going to really dig into this. So we had things set up so I could spend as much time as I wanted in study, and I took it. I often spent 10 to 14 hours a day just pouring through this problem, looking at what do I know, and why am I uncomfortable? Why do I feel some of these things don't fit? And I recognized early on it was a problem of geography. And the geography I'm reading about the Nabateans ending, the Byzantines coming in place, and then the geography I'm reading about early Islamic history, there was something there that wasn't right. And so I started in 2010, and very quickly, within I think 3 weeks of starting on this, I realized one of the issues that I needed to tackle was that of the Qibla question. You see, I had become uncomfortable with the question of the Qibla over the last years before this. I was aware that the Qibla was changed by the Prophet Muhammad. He came, and when he moved to Medina, he was in Medina. We have the dates of when he arrived. About 17 months later, he announced that the Qibla would change. Now, this was interesting from many different angles. One of them is the word Qibla. Where does the word Qibla come from? It's not a word that is used by anybody else. It's only used in the Quran, and it seems to refer, if you read the Quran and try to read the early writers, it referred to the direction one faced when one prayed. And that's as simple as it was. It's the direction you faced when you prayed. And people would pray always facing towards the Qibla direction. Eventually, it was used for more things, such as when a person kills an animal, if he faced towards the Qibla direction and slit the throat of the animal and drained the blood, then it was done in a halal way. So the Qibla direction was important for everyone. The earliest records of the Qibla and the word Qibla come from the Quran. So we don't go to the hadiths or to others. We can go directly to the Quran and we can discover the word Qibla in Surah chapter 2. And it's very plain that the Qibla direction was changed from its original direction to Masjid al-Haram. That's all it tells us. It doesn't mention the Kaaba. The Kaaba's not mentioned there. The black rock is not mentioned there. It simply is turn your face now to a Qibla that God is giving to them. He said, this is a good Qibla. This is something you'll be happy with. Turn towards Masjid al-Haram. And so that's all the instruction we're given. Now, other religions don't have a Qibla in the same sense. There isn't a holy direction for them. Now, the earliest we might get a hint of this is when Solomon is dedicating his temple, the temple in Jerusalem, and he prays. And during that prayer, he prays, God, if anyone turns his face towards this temple where you have put your name, then bless them and hear their prayer. And so this is the first concept we have, that if people turned and prayed towards the temple in Jerusalem where the name of God is, that Solomon asked that God would bless them. So it's not a command from God, and Jews don't have to face Jerusalem, and they don't feel like they have to figure out where Jerusalem is or God won't hear their prayer. It was in a prayer of Solomon's that this was first mentioned. Later on, it became common in the churches, Christian churches, as Christianity grew up, that people would face east. This is particularly important in the graves, simply because Christians were buried on their back and put down, and the idea was that when Christ returned, he would return in the eastern sky. And so they laid the body down in the grave, and the idea was when the body sat up on resurrection day, it would face east. So the feet always were pointed in the eastern way, and some churches are oriented towards the east, but not all churches were. There's no command in Christianity to face east. It's simply a tradition that developed over time. So Muslims are unique in that they have this holy direction, or this Qibla, this direction you face. And it is common among Muslims to think, oh yeah, all these other religions have a Qibla. They're often quite surprised to discover that the Qibla is not generally understood in other religions, and especially among Protestants who are totally clueless about direction and so forth, because it comes out of tradition, and the Protestants have in many cases cast off tradition, and they have returned back to just the words of Holy Scripture. And for them, if it's not written in the Old and in the New Testament, then it's not important. God would put only what was important in those books. And so since those books don't mention the Qibla or a direction of prayer, it is not important to those who are holding to the Word of God, to the Bible as their direction, and have ignored a lot of the tradition that has developed in the churches over the years. So, the word Qibla is a Muslim concept. It comes to Islam, and when the Quran speaks of it, it assumes that people know what the Qibla means. So we have no real archaeological records, though, of the early Qibla. We are simply told that the message came to Muhammad, and they've worked out, Muslim historians and scholars have worked out the date to the 11th of February, 624 AD, and this is the first year in the Islamic calendar, and this is the year when the Hijrah took place, okay, and then 17 months later comes the 11th of February. In 624, Muhammad receives a message from God that they should change the Qibla direction, and so that message goes out. We know that it came quite early on. Maybe the first place it came was to the people who were praying in the mosque in Quba. And there it's a village just outside of Medina, and so they stood up, turned around, and faced towards Mecca. That's what we're told. Now, the problem is, as we read the hadiths and the histories, different terminology comes out. You see, the problem is that there's no archaeological record for this. We don't have the early mosque and where it faced, and then the next mosque and where it is. So we can't go back and look at stones. We'll talk a minute about the different mosques, but to be absolutely certain, that is a problem. We don't have any writers of the time actually writing down what took place. The writers who write down are a generation or even two generations later, and they don't all agree. Some of them say he was praying towards Al-Quds, which would be Jerusalem. Some say he's praying towards Asham, which could mean north, or it could mean Damascus. And so there is not agreement. And even the same writers will quote different hadiths and have different directions in there. So I recognize this was a problem. Now, the biggest problem I had was that as I had been traveling around the Middle East, and when I would go to a place, I would try to understand the entire history that was there. So when I was in a city, I wasn't just looking at early history. I was looking at the early history, the Islamic history. I mean, what could I learn while I was visiting this site or this city or whatever? And I became aware that in a number of mosques where I had gone to visit, that the curator of the mosque or the guide who was there would say, this mosque originally faced towards Jerusalem, and then later it turned and it was faced towards Mecca and Saudi Arabia. And I would make a note of that and just move on. And later on I realized, I've seen a lot of mosques. I mean, I thought in 17 months, when Muhammad moved to Medina, he brought his people there. There are virtually no other Muslims in other places. There may have been a few left back in the original holy city. There might have been a few who went other places. But generally, you would only look for the early Muslims according to their history. In Medina, there might have been a few Muslims who had stayed in Ethiopia, and there might have been a few who had gone somewhere else. But the question is, how could there be a mosque in Oman, or several mosques in Oman, that faced Jerusalem and later faced towards Mecca and Saudi Arabia? And how about these others? And I began to realize, wait a minute, something doesn't make sense. In 17 months, did they build these other mosques? And so I began to realize I have to study the Qibla direction. And in order to study it, I need to look and study the early mosques, because they will give me some sort of indication of when this date took place. I recognize the problem is the date. Islamic history gives us only 17 months. And so I began visit these mosques, and I began to chart them. I have a GPS unit that I used, a very early one, going out trying to determine it. Fortunately, we also had some satellite photos that were becoming available that I could use the technology that was available, and began to look at that. And I began to recognize that they were pointing different places. It was early on. I mean, I started in September, and I remember in November, I said to my wife, I said, you know, when I started out, I thought maybe this whole thing about the Qibla was going to be some sort of, theory that I would put out. But I said, I'm finding so much information that I'm beginning to question, is this actually true? I mean, I thought it was going to just write, here's a possible explanation, but I'm starting to look at this and say, there is a lot of evidence here. And so I began to put together the evidence and started building a database, trying to figure out. And so I started with just a spreadsheet. I originally thought I was only going to have to look at 4 or 5 mosques. That should solve the problem. And the problem got bigger and bigger, and so I started collecting more and more information. And eventually I started making a list. At the end of that year, I produced the book, Quranic Geography, and it was not about the Qibla, it was not about the Qibla direction, it was mostly about the history of Arabia that I had been studying and looking at and gathering notes for some, 20 years or almost 30 years before that. So the thing about the Qibla and the direction, it was tucked away at the back of the book, and it was just a question that came up. And at that point, I had drawn lines and maps, I had gathered information, and I had recognized it seemed that the early mosques all faced towards the city of Petra in Jordan, and not towards Jerusalem or towards Mecca. I hadn't found any mosques towards Mecca until much, much later. So that was the early, at that point, didn't even recognize there was a between mosque. So if you read Quranic Geography, it's the initial discovery of the Qibla and the questions of the Qibla and so forth. I had realized I had to do more study, but I wanted to introduce it, and I wanted to hear back from other people and to see what they said, what their explanation was. So what I'd like to do is, at this point, if I've got a couple mice here and a couple computers, I'm going to take us over to this, the early Qibla tool that we have, the Qibla tool. And so we're turning our attention here. You'll see somewhere here, my mouse, there it is moving on the map here. You can see down here is the city of Medina. And up here we have Petra and we have Jerusalem. They are in much the same direction. Now, please remember, the early Muslims did not have GPS units. They could not accurately, within a degree or a fraction of a degree, determine the Qibla direction. They used what was called the Arab compass, which was the rising and setting of certain stars. So in the evening, certain stars would rise, they would go across the horizon, and then they would set. And so direction was calculated using the rising and setting of these different stars. There were 224 different stars that rose over and went down. And so they had they could measure this, but in today's calculation, they were good if they were within 3 or 4 degrees. And that's quite common to when we check the early Qibla. So it wasn't always exact. Now here, we can recognize that the early mosques were in Medina. If you look up here on the right, you will see the Quba Mosque, which is in Medina, the Prophet's Mosque, which is in Medina, the Mosque of the Two Qiblas, this is Qiblatain Mosque. Qiblatain, the tain means the two, the doubling of it. You have the Janad Mosque as well, and the Jawthar Mosque. So all of these mosques were built within the first 8 years of the founding of Islam. Our problem with this is that none of these mosques are conclusive in where they point. Now, if you look at what I've got on the right, we have Quba over here, which is where the announcement was made. Muhammad had decreed to change the mosque. The Prophet's mosque is where he was when he made that announcement. And the Qibla Mosque. Now, this is an interesting mosque, and I'm going to just click on it here. You'll see we can click on any of these, but let me click on it, and we'll come back down here. And this is the Qibla Mosque today. Now, if you look over here on the right, we have the Qibla towards Petra, or the direction towards Jerusalem, on green towards Mecca. And you will see that this mosque aligns to Mecca today. Straight down the line goes towards Mecca. That lines up with the building. And so this building, if you were facing this long wall here in within the mosque, you are facing towards the city of Mecca. Now, the problem is this is a very modern building. If we click down here on more information, it will take us over here and tell us that this mosque, which was built in the year 5 after the Hijrah, it was rebuilt in 88 after the Hijrah, and in our modern date, 1987, was the last major construction. So when you're here looking at this mosque, you're looking at something that was built in 1987. So the original foundation of this mosque no longer exists. If you go and visit this mosque, there is no evidence of where it was. However, there is something about this mosque that is good and exciting, and that is that when this mosque was in construction in 1987, that the people who were digging of the mosque came across the foundation of the original mosque. And they looked at it. There's Abdul Wahid al-Wakil. He was an engineer, an architect who was there. He made drawings. As soon as they uncovered it, he got in and made some drawings of this. So we have a record of that early foundation. And indeed, it did face north. Now, those stones are gone. They've removed it. All we have is this record, and unfortunately, it's very difficult to tell within a couple of degrees how this drawing is oriented and what direction it actually faces. You see, at the time, there was no question about the Qibla. They all understood the Qibla faced towards Jerusalem. And here we have evidence. We dig down, and this mosque had two Qiblas at this point, and one faced towards Jerusalem and one faced towards Mecca. So it's the Qibla Mosque. Let's go back and look at this, though. The problem here that we have is that we don't have any good measurements from 1987. It was just assumed that it faces towards Jerusalem. So what do we do when we back up and we look at these and we see that the line goes up here and it faces here? Now, here's the question. Does it face on Petra? Does it face on Jerusalem? How do you line up these drawings? And in my mind, at least, it points closer to Petra than to Jerusalem. However, when I have tried to figure out or put into the database, I put Jerusalem and Petra. Because you could argue that this pointed to Jerusalem. You could argue it pointed to Petra. The problem is we're only dealing with one measurement. So a lot of people come on, I want to know, and they start working at within a half a degree or a fraction of a degree and things. That doesn't, to me, that doesn't make any sense. They didn't have the technology to get in within a fraction of a degree. If they did, they were fortunate. If they didn't, they were out 2 or 3 degrees. Some are even out as much as 5. The average is about 3 degrees, within 3 degrees of the where they were wanted to point. So I refuse to classify this and say this points towards Petra. The strength of it is, if I change and if I come over here now, I was doing this, if you look back on this map, under the age of Muhammad. Let me go over here, because I can pick Muhammad, mosque built during Abu Bakr's time, mosques built during Umar's time, or Uthman's time, then the Umayyads up to the second fitna. This is when they built. Then during the second fitna, the second civil war, the mosques were built at this time. Then the Umayyads who built after the second fitna, the Abbasids. And then that split time, Abbasids on one side, Umayyads on the other, looking particularly at North Africa and Spain. That's the last one. But let's go over here and let's look down and let's show what points towards the city of Petra. Because these, you will notice, are all, again, they're 15 after the Hijrah, 21, 70, 80, and so forth. So most of these at the top are built within 100 years, the first 100 years of Islam. And so there's actually, if you go down, you'll start to begin to see we've got, I'll have to count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 22 different mosques. So we're not measuring one mosque. We're looking at 22 different mosques that appear to point to southern Jordan. And so if you come over here to this map, you can see that here in the middle is the city of Petra, and here are the Qiblas. Some of them end up going south a ways, some of them end up going north a ways. This down here is Humayma, and so it's 27 miles from Petra. So, I mean, we're talking in a circle this big, and some of those mosques are quite far away, and they're pointing up in this direction. The challenge here is not to get down to within a degree or a fraction of a degree. The strength of this argument is on over 20 mosques that face this direction. Their Qibla faces here. Now, Dr. King and others who argue against me say, well, these mosques all faced south. And I agree they face south, but there are also some from the east, some from the west, and some from below who are facing north. And they're pointing in this direction. And so that led me to suddenly realize the city of Petra, where I had spent a lot of time studying, was the focus of the Qibla. That was a eureka moment for me, but it's also a very sobering moment, because I realized, how in the world am I ever going to prove this? And it seems very convenient that I had spent 20 years studying the city of Petra and of the Nabatean people and tracing their whereabouts. And suddenly, when I'm studying Islam, the Petra suddenly pops up as being an important place. It may seem a bit convenient, but I mean, I had a hard time believing it. In fact, I went around for the next couple of years trying to disprove what I had found. In fact, back when I was that first year, I spent quite a bit of time trying to disprove that I had discovered this Petra thing. And so I had all these other mosques that later became between. I didn't know they all existed. I only knew a couple of them were off by at least 11 to 12 degrees. And so I had just so my circle was much bigger than that around Petra. It wasn't until much later I discovered the between mosques, and then that isolated that group and left us with the Petra group. So we've got 20 different mosques that we can look at and we can measure, and that gives us the data with which we can gather and say, I don't think this was a mistake. I don't think this was chance. This is not just talking about one or two mosques. We are here talking about a pattern that fits mosques. Now, notice in those early years, and you're looking up here on the right, you'll notice that if I'm picking, none of these point towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So the first ones are all unknown. Abu Bakr's time, there's only 2 different places here, and they are also unknown. If I go to Umar's, here's Petra, unknown, because unknown means they were rebuilt. And so we can't measure because the mosque is gone. When we get over here in Uthman's time, they've also all been rebuilt. So we get to the Umayyads here, and again, they're all Petra, but there's a few unknowns. We can't quite tell, but these are all facing Petra. We haven't got what's important here is we are now working up to the second civil war, and not a single mosque has pointed to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. That was shocking to me. And it should be shocking to you, because here we are up to 80 years after the Hijrah, and at this point still every mosque that has ever been constructed in Islam that we can measure, that's the important thing, those that we can still measure point to the city of Petra. All the big important mosques that we have today, like Qibla and Quba and others, they've all been bulldozed, knocked down, rebuilt, and so we cannot measure that original Qibla. So then we get to the one after the Civil War, when we're getting to the years after. They're lined up here: 81 AH, 86, 87 after the Hijrah, 90 after the Hijrah. Now, some of these are between, but where's Mecca? When are we going to come to a city that is facing Mecca? Ah, there it is. We have one here, which is 112 years after Mecca. I should have had one before. Where is it? Okay, but we'll see Mecca begin to show up here as we go along. So there is questions here, and then under the Abbasid time, then we have all these different Mecca mosques. And suddenly Mecca becomes one. Now there's one Jerusalem here, we'll talk about it later, but these, the pattern that I wanted you to see is that mosques built towards Mecca begin 109 years after the Hijrah. So basically, in the first 100 years of Islamic history, not a single mosque faced towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Now, Dr. King and others who in his group of scholars have said, well, this is because they measured the Qibla differently. This is because they weren't facing Masjid al-Haram. They were, people had gone to Mecca. They had been there. They had picked up some direction there. Maybe they had stood on one side of the Qibla, of the Kaaba building or another. And he said, well, actually, and then he said it's not Masjid al-Haram that they're measuring. They're measuring the actual Kaaba building and the way the building is oriented. And maybe they took a measurement off of this corner or off of this wall or whatever, went back to their home countries, and then did that. And that's his possibility. And that is based on the medieval people writing, some a couple hundred years later, some of them 400 or 500 years after the fact, and that's what they came up with in the time of the medieval Muslim scholars who were trying to answer, why does this mosque in my hometown seem so strange? But when we back up and when we look at the city of Petra and we have a look at this, we discover all of these different mosques that are facing towards the city of Petra. Okay, that's the beginning. Petra was the focus, and I have got videos, tapes we've made here. You can look on them and see how we've talked about different evidence. And in the book, Early Islamic Qiblas, I've gone back and had a look at the different evidences that would support this. Because after I looked at this, I said, I've got to reread Islamic history. And I went back and began pouring through Al-Tabri, pouring through the writings of Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq and others, trying to put together this history and what happened there. And is there any hint that there was pointing towards, they were praying towards the city of Petra? And I've come up with over 50 different evidences. Now, they're just supporting evidences. The actual argument is based on Qibla directions that we have been able to go back and measure, based on the teaching of the Quran in Surah chapter 2, that Muslims were to face towards Masjid al-Haram. And we've gone back, and as I have pointed out later, and in some of the other videos, we've gone back and have identified Masjid al-Haram in the city of Petra. We've even identified what appears to be the Kaaba building, the original structure, and its measurements match exactly those of Zraki and others who have described the first Kaaba building during the lifetime of Muhammad, even giving measurements of the lengths of the sides. There's 4 different lengths because the building wasn't exactly square. It was off on an angle a little bit and quite different measurements. We found the building that fits, the foundation of a building that fits that, and as we look at it, this looks like the original Kaaba building. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And on this tape, all we're covering is the question about Jerusalem and introducing the topic of Petra, and that's all I can find. Is I have no solid evidence for Jerusalem, and they might have prayed towards Jerusalem. Only Bukhari and a few others writing 300 years after the fact mention it, and so. Was it there? Was it Sham? Was it Damascus? Were they just praying north? That is not clear. We can't identify that in stone on foundations of mosques. That has all been erased. What we do have is over 20 structures out of about another 20 more that have been destroyed from the first 100 years of Islam. That's a lot of buildings that have survived from that time to now, and all of those Qiblas seem to point towards the city of Petra. Then something happened, and that's we're going to look at in the next video, and then we'll continue on in there in the story of the Qibla and how it changed and how it got to Mecca today. Thank you. I'm Dan Gibson. This has been another video and the first video in a series on the Qibla story.